Greetings, traveler. I'm SnapJelly, and in the past I have made several statements about spinning with swords during a sword fight and why you shouldn't do it. And I still, to this day, get comments of people saying stuff like, have you taken into consideration spinning back fists in boxing? Or like spinning back kicks in fucking taekwondo or karate or whatever? And to those people, I have to say, have you taken into the consideration that different martial arts have different principles? Like to anybody who practices multiple different martial arts, like myself, you would know that different martial arts have similar principles that you can kind of like take over into other martial arts. You would also know that those same martial arts have principles that you absolutely cannot take over into other martial arts. Hence why there's different kinds of martial arts. You see, something that people tend to forget when they compare sword fighting, historical sword fighting, to other martial arts is the sword. It's true, it might sound stupid, but adding weapons to any kind of scenario completely changes the name of the game. It really does. So like, for example, imagine two people fighting and they have nothing with them. It's just them and their bodies. What do? They punch, they kick, they grab, they headbutt, they bite, they scratch, they poke the eyes, whatever. All that is fine, right? Now, give one of those people a knife. All of a sudden, what happens? The fight would still contain a lot of the same stuff, but everything that I just mentioned is secondary, because the person who doesn't have the knife would at first, his primary purpose is to grab the arm of the person holding the knife, to get control of the knife, because if he doesn't get control of the knife, he's gonna get stabbed. He might initiate a first punch and then he has a knife in the gut and he dies. That knife wound is way worse. So the first thing people do is they wanted to have control of the weapon. The fight changes, it becomes a struggle for the weapon, and all the punches and the kicks and whatever is secondary distraction to try and get control of the weapon. Even if there's a weapon on the ground somewhere. Visible for everybody, right? There's two people, they're fighting and there's a knife or bat or whatever on the ground. Both of them would die for the weapon, most likely, if they know it's there. Because, in most cases, it is beneficial to have a weapon, even if you receive a few punches and kicks, because that weapon gives you such a huge benefit. Like, your opponent can have you in a chokehold, like a real bad chokehold, and that could only last a couple seconds before you get passed out. But if you're in the chokehold, and while you're in the chokehold, you can reach for a knife or something sharp, you win right there, because you can stab him with that, and there you go, you've won. So, even if your opponent is a fucking wrestling master who has you in the best chokehold ever, he would still, at first, try to get control of the weapon, or make sure that you don't have control of the weapon. It completely changes everything. And now give both people a knife, for example, just a knife in their hands, all of a sudden what happens? They don't engage at all, most likely. They will stay at a distance, because if they get too close, they'll get stabbed. They might stab you as well, but they'll get stabbed as well, and they don't want that. So adding weapons changes everything. And that's why things like spinning back fists and such don't really work in sword fighting. And I'm gonna try and explain that in this video. I didn't really make any notes, so I'm just gonna ramble for a bit, but hopefully I'll get the message across. Let's just start. There's actually quite a few things to keep in mind. Let's just get a boxing scenario, right? Two boxers in a scenario where one of them might throw a spinning back fist. One of the things you have to keep in mind is distance. You have to, of course, be in distance in order to be able to reach your opponent. Now, in boxing, of course, getting hit is not preferable. You don't want to get hit. You have to keep your guard up always. But it's a lot different than it is in sword fighting, because in a boxing match, you'll find that both boxers get hit a plethora of times during the match. Right? It very rarely happens that one of the two never gets hit. However, in sword fighting, that's not the case. You have to never get hit. Because getting hit once, you're pretty much dead. Or if you're not dead, you're incapacitated and you cannot continue the fight. So there are, of course, some examples of people getting hit and still continuing the fight, but you have to keep in mind that you cannot count on that. You cannot count on getting a sword stabbed in your torso and still being fine and fighting on. So sword fighters, they always stand at a distance where they cannot reach each other. And if you want to hit the other person, you have to engage, you have to step in and move in order to attack the other person. Whereas a boxer, for example, might be more likely to be in reach because they can take a few hits on the defense. And in sword fighting, that's not the case. A boxer's defense is not per se easier because, of course, taking the hits even on the defense is a lot, it takes energy. But sword fighting is very different in that aspect because there is no one guard that protects you completely all the time. You have to constantly shift guards, shift guard positions. You have to see what your opponent is, how your opponent is moving, what ways you could possibly attack from those positions, and how you'd want to counter those positions. All of which while out of reach, so that when he engages in a way that you hopefully expect, you can parry successfully. With boxing, this is less the case because defense it requires less movement than sword fighting does. So it's easier to just take a few blows and then perform a spin attack. Whilst in sword fighting, if you want to perform that spin attack, you would have to first make sure that you parry successfully, because you can't really engage enough that's necessary for sword fight and spin at the same time. So it would have to be when your opponent is attacking you, you would have to perform the spin and attack. Technically that's possible, I guess, in one scenario, which I'm going to explain in a second, but first I'd have to say that you have to parry first. There's no way that your opponent purposefully gets in range of you for you to attack him without attacking you. Which means that his blade is coming your way, it's going towards your body. This only happens if your opponent is confident enough that he can land a blow that you cannot parry. Otherwise there's no point. Right? Or he expects you to parry a certain way and then counters that again. There's variables, but still, let's just say that your opponent doesn't attack if he is confident that you can defend it. Right? It's a mind game in a way. So your opponent attacks in a certain way that you hopefully expect, and you have to defend against it, because if you don't, you get hit. So have fun spinning around, but you have to parry that attack first. And if you parry that attack and then decide to spin, your opponent can just throw another attack. And you have to parry that again. So there's the difference. If you get punched in the back in a boxing match, it's not as big a deal as it is to get stabbed in the back with a sword. So one way where the spin attack could work technically is if your opponent goes for your head and you duck underneath it, then you could technically perform a spin, I guess. But you don't have to. In that way, I think it's possible to successfully perform a spin attack, but I will also say that it's redundant. Because if your opponent attacks you and you duck underneath it, that means he's in reach, which means that you can just extend your arms right there and you stabbed him. Now you might say, Jelly, spin attacks are faster than normal attacks. I say no. Perhaps spinning back kicks are faster, or not, I guess. But, well, in sword fighting that's not the case. Generally people say that you can do 2 arm movements in the same speed as 1 leg movement. It's not precisely right, but basically what it means is that a thrust with your arm is a lot faster than a lunge, a thrust with your entire body, even though the lunge has more reach, right? And likewise, parrying with your arms is a lot faster than sidestepping, for example. So sidestepping is a valuable option, but it's not always a valuable option. It's only a valuable option if you have enough time, right? The spin is a full body movement, whereas a normal thrust with your arms, since your opponent is already in reach, if he could reach you so that you actually have to duck underneath the attack, you can just extend your arms and you can reach him as well. So you could perform a spin, but it's not necessary. And it's also a lot slower. And the extra time that it costs to perform a spin will possibly give your opponent, no, actually it will quite clearly give your opponent enough time to make another movement and still hit you, so it will be a double and you're both dead. Another important thing, a super important thing actually, that people tend to forget very easily is trajectory of the cut, right? What that means is a cut with a sword, it always has to travel in a straight line, and people fight with dull weapons, which hopefully you do if you do fight with weapons, then they tend to forget that edge alignment is incredibly important. If you don't get the edge alignment right, you won't cut your opponent. If a cut doesn't go in a completely straight line, but it edges slightly, the sword will kind of just awkwardly bounce, and you might make a slight cut, but it won't be very deep or very powerful. So if you do the spin it just makes it way more difficult to actually get your sword straight into your opponent and to get the trajectory of the sword cut completely straight as well than it would be if you just perform a normal cut. So you might, you might pull off the spin, but will you also pull off the cut? You might. Is it worth the risk? No. But Jelly, you might say, Jelly, spin attacks are stronger than normal cuts or whatever, because spinning back kicks are stronger than normal kicks. I would argue against that, but I'm not going to get all sciencey about why that may or may not be the case. For the sake of argument, let's just say that it is. Okay, let's say that the spin attack is stronger than a normal attack. That is still pointless, because if your opponent is unarmored, then a normal attack, a normal cut, is easily enough to just chop his head clean off, or his arms, or thrust through his body and stick it out of the other end. Whatever. You might add more strength to that, but you're gonna chop his head off more. It's already off, he's already dead, there's no point. And if your opponent wears armor to an extent where a normal cut would not break through it, then a spin attack cut will also not break through it. You might wear just a thick gambeson and you could say that a normal cut might not get all the way through, and a spin attack cut then would get all the way through, but then the effects would be minimal. You would make a tiny cut. Yeah, there's way more benefit into just stabbing an unarmored spot in that case, which is very hard to do if you're not actually looking at your opponent. Also, like thrusting during a spin, that would really take away all the benefit, I think, from a spin attack, doesn't it? I don't really know how that would work, but well. The thing about that is, in a sword fight, both parties would be holding a sword, which means that if you get in range close enough, because you could argue, for example, that one might try a spinning back pommel, like a pommel strike. There's pommel strikes. If you get close enough, there's pommel strikes. But like I just explained in the beginning, both parties are holding a sword, a sharp edged weapon, and their primary goal is, of course, to get the sharp edged weapon into their opponent. So when they're close enough to actually start throwing punches, their primary goal is to use that weapon. With the point, you could also smack with the pommel, because that's very effective. But at first, they would want to get control of their opponent's sword arm, so they don't get stabbed or they don't get pommeled in the face. So if you get close enough that you could possibly pull off a spinning back pommel, the first thing your opponent is gonna do, and what you also should do, is wrestle. You need to get control of your opponent's sword arm. And that's what you see in He-Man, that's what you see described in the manuals. Now you might also say, Jelly, spinning is it's beneficial because you surprise your opponent, right? That's a thing that people in video games always say. It's like a fucking, unexpected, because you quickly attack him from the other side. Here's the thing, there are ways to quickly attack your opponent from the other side without spinning. Believe it or not, something like a swordcow exists. I cannot do it with a longsword here because I don't have enough space. Imagine this is a longsword, okay? Your opponent attacks, you parry. Oh, now I quickly want to attack the other side. What do? Spin? No, I do this. There you go. I just attacked the other side. Look at that. Oh, I want to attack a bit lower? I can still do that. Hooray! It's not hard at all. And that's just an arm movement. There's no need to spin your entire body. There's really... If you do it successfully, which there is a slight chance that you do it successfully, then there's really no benefit to it as opposed to just performing an ordinary cut. That's the thing with spin attacks in sword fighting. So I think about that covers about everything. If you stuck around this long, you might as well subscribe. Also follow me on social media, links are in the description below. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye guys.